the UN, the World Economic Forum, the big players, the Rockefellers, they're all intrinsically driving this, but now through not only lobbying corporations, but lobbying governments. And this is where it's not just national governments, it's intranational governments, EU, and you know, the United Nations effectively operating as a global governance, vehicle. So this is where we then become enslaved into this kind of dystopic, global institutionalized framework that becomes increasingly strictly enforced. And that's when it's in the world of digital technology now.
Yeah.
You know, if this had happened 100 years ago, you would find it very hard to institutionalize. You know, it would be manual work, manual ledgers, but now our behavior can be governed by the devices that we hold in our phone, because we saw it through COVID. You know, your QR code to get in and out of the building, your vaccine passports.
Yeah.
You know, now behavior, you know, through ESG, social credit systems, behaviorally linked, you know, and we're seeing it. Like, anyone who has their eyes closed may not be seeing this, but even now, like the story around the bank closures, you know, you have to have certain right think or left think, you could call it, in certain ways to get a bank account. Now, before we get into today's episode, I want to let you know something important, that this weekend we're attending the Campout live event, which is hosted by myself and Pete Lawrence. And we're delighted to have Sam with us this weekend, where he's going to give us an introduction to crypto and the financial reset. Sam, in a couple of sentences, what are you going to be covering this weekend?
Well, you struggle to shrink it down because it's going to be a big holistic look. But we're going to be looking at the cycles, the astrology, the practicalities, this shift towards digital technology, the good, the bad, and the ugly side of it, and how we can navigate ourselves and make progress so that we are the captain of our own ship, driving our own path forward. We're aware of their path, but we're on our path, and having hopefully lots of really interesting nuanced discussions around it with the people who are there. So looking forward to it, Dan.
Thank you. Yeah, and tune into the end of this episode where Sam will speak a little more about what he's going to be showing at this. I put him under a little bit of pressure. There's a couple of lines. Tune into the end where you'll hear a little bit more about what Sam's going to be covering, plus a special discount code if you want to join us. So head over to campout.live, listen to the end of this episode, and you'll get a special discount code if you'd like to join us. But for now, let's get into today's episode, ESG and the Great Reset. From last week's episode where we talked about health and wealth, we're now shifting gears to look at the bigger macro picture again and understand what is going on in the wider world. We're hearing all these things around go woke, go broke. What does that mean? Why are corporations suddenly jumping on socially progressive policies? What's it all about? What is ESG? Where did it come from? Where does it play out in the bigger agendas flowing? This is a big topic. It's an emotive topic, one that's really important that we start to get our heads around, because to me, it's one of the pieces that starts to help us understand why the world is behaving in the way that it does. So, Sam, a big topic for us to get our teeth into today.
It's a massive one. It's one that people need to understand, Dan, because the ramifications of it are enormous. And we spoke before coming on air that, you know, it's a good job we're probably not on the coffees, because we'd probably be exploding with, you know, the ridiculousness of lots of it and how far the tentacles of it reach out and how much is being put in place. And I think it's critical to understand this. And, you know, like all in all actions, what we're talking about, it will probably, you know, when you understand more of these things clearer, give you a greater call to begin your journey of trying to decentralize your life. And we talk about whether that's financially wise or business or whatever, because these things, this is, you know, and again, nothing set in stone, but it's really important to go, this roadmap is advancing at quite a pace. It's been in process for a long time, but, you know, things are really ramping up from now. And again, key dates will come into our mind, like 2025, which I talk a lot about financial reset. So this is a biggie, and we'll see where we go on the journey, because it's huge.
Yeah, it's an important one. I must have read somewhere between 30 and 50 articles for this, including some fairly chunky reports, which kind of highlight what ESG is, how it's measured, where it came from. So we're going to talk about all of that. We're going to talk about what is ESG, where did it come from, what are its implications, how is it playing out now, and also what is its ultimate long-term prognosis, which is where I get most concerned about where this could actually head.
Yeah.
And it reaffirms a lot of the fears that people have around central bank digital currencies, digital IDs, social credit scores, and how these things all come together. And worryingly, how they all come together in a very centralized, globalized, and institutionalized form, which is the kind of way this is being rolled out. So this is essential listening. Please hit the share button. We're going to be dive into this. So ESG, what does that stand for? It stands for environmental social governance. It's a new set of metrics. Traditionally, companies have been measured by their return on investment for shareholders, shareholder returns, alongside other financial metrics, which means that when you do that, and it's not the perfect way of obviously tracking a company's impact on society or the environment, but it has a very basic metric that encompasses its overall performance. And we're not here to discuss the management theory around all of this today. We're actually looking at the political social ramifications of ESG. But there is an argument that a company that is measured by profitability, in order to be profitable, it has to have happy, engaged employees in order to produce a great product. It has to produce good products to serve the marketplace and make a difference. Now, where there is obviously a gap is the way in which that is done upon its, the company's impact upon its environment. But as we talk about things like ESG, we'll also assess, does the thing actually work? So
Yeah.
ESG stands for environmental social governance. It's a new set of scorecards. There are a variety of companies that produce indexes on this. And at its core, it's at its essence is about encouraging companies to behave in certain ways to support the environment, to support social factors, and to have good governance. Now, where it gets tricky, as we'll discuss, is how we interpret those. So, Sam, do you want to pick up the baton from here?
Yeah, well, I think it's if you looked at it without understanding the ramifications and just on the surface, like a lot of these agendas, it can seem quite innocent and quite positive, and if you're not aware of a lot of nefarious things that have gone on in the last years, then it might come across to you that when you just brush over the surface, because in essence, it's encapsulating this shift from shareholder capital to stakeholder capital. And I think we're all aware that, a lot of large corporations have been very problematic, and therefore, just pushing for the bottom line, regardless of their impact on the environment or social issues. So it seems like, well, that's a great, it's calling them to account. So that seems like a real big improvement, and moving to a stakeholder capital where, as you said, Dan, everybody's a stakeholder. Everything that's affected by that company's actions is a stakeholder. But again, it's where is the sort of metrics and the definition of what is good for all these stakeholders, and the stakeholder being sort of the underlying biggest stakeholder, which they're kind of using and weaponizing, is making nature, the environment, the ultimate stakeholder. But who is deciding with what science, what is best for that and how that plays out? So again, it can look very cleverly like a positive shift of getting a hold of, overly greedy capitalist companies who are not respecting, values, outside of their pure bottom line. But actually, as we'll dig into the weeds, we'll see it's actually quite a different beast than that, Dan. And that's why it's so important, like we're doing today, to dig beneath the surface, because so many people, we talk about in our busy world, don't have time to. They just get the headlines, and it never really gets into the weeds. And that's why it takes time to. And I think that's why some things get pushed through, is obviously with all the spin doctors, the way the media works, control narrative, it can just seem like really progressive, improvements to existing world problems. But actually, it's a huge shift, and the ramifications of it of more control, greater centralization, are all really what's driving it. And so again, I repeat myself, but the ramifications of it are huge. So that's why it's so important to understand.
Yeah, and in the preparation for this episode, I had to kind of look myself in the mirror and say, am I triggered by this because of my own political views? Is that what it is? And, would I be a cheerleader for it if it supported my own, preferences for freedom and democracy? And maybe that would be the case. Maybe if there was a freedom and democracy index, that I would maybe support it. But but I have to catch myself even then, because when we're using corporations to do the bidding for political causes, which is essentially what's coming here, that line between business and politics begins to blur. And in historical cases, that's known as fascism, corporate fascism. And we'll talk more about that later today, because to me, that's one of the greatest risks occurring here, where those lines are becoming increasingly blurry. We'll talk about how some of the mechanisms of traditional democratic processes are being overridden by this kind of corporatized approach. Sam, you talked about stakeholder capitalism, which is at the heart of the World Economic Forum model. They've been advocating for that for the last 60 years. So again, you can see how that slide has now occurred. But I'm with you, Sam, in terms of when I think most people watching this, in their core, want to tread lightly on the earth. They actually do care about nature.
Mm.
They would like to live in a world where there is less pollution. They do want to be good citizens, and most how we determine what a good citizen is, has become highly politicized and subjective. But I think in their core, most people I know who watch this show, care about human beings, they care about nature, and they want to have meaning and purpose in their life and make a difference. So when the wider world sees this thing around it, but our audience will look at this with a skeptical eye, which is great. But the wider world, when they see this ESG thing, it's like, well, why wouldn't we want to, as you said, do things differently? But it's how it happens, and when we go into its origin story, where it came from. Already from day one, we can see where it becomes problematic. So, Sam, do you want to talk about the unveiling of the first report? Who cares wins by the United Nations?
Who cares wins? So this term, ESG, environmental social governance, was coined back in this UN report, which was in cahoots a lot of big banks, the World Bank, a lot of the Swiss government entities involved in that, and exactly, Dan, that title, "Who Cares Wins." Right, so emotive, right? And again, as you said there, what's so clever about the way they design these kind of ideology agendas is if you are questioning them, you are immediately just accused of being you don't care then, Dan. We're talking about caring. This is all about caring. So who cares wins. This is this is about rewarding people who care. And if you don't agree with any of it, you don't care. You're selfish, you're against that, which is not the case at all, but that's where it can be oversimplified and weaponized, so exactly that. When we talk about anybody questioning the kind of carbon narrative, the current sort of climate change ideology and a lot of the science, if you're just questioning that, rather than people get into debate about absolutely questionable different aspects of science, it's just you don't care about the environment then. And as exactly as you said, the vast communities of skeptical, aware people absolutely do, but they understand that a lot of these genders are dressed up in this really powerful, emotive language. But what's beneath them actually is not really what I'd call person-centered, Dan. And I think that's where they're really clever, and in being able to push it, is it's putting the environment ahead of people. And then, and from an ideological point of view, they could argue that's what you need to do. But they've changed so much science and there's so much fudging around that again, I'd argue is bad science as well and needs to be questioned. So it's always, you've got to get to the fundamentals, the bottom line. But, so that was back in 2004, that long report. And again, we've looked at a lot of documents in our research, and down, and some of them are extraordinary to look at and read, and the language, and I mean, extraordinary ways. But it's interesting that it came out there, but then it really was brought, and this ties into your point about corporate fascism. Fascism being that the corporations actually having the real power and driving it, is that who really brought into the public awareness, because not many people we've been talking about then, was Larry Fink of BlackRock. Okay, one of the biggest firms. A lot of people argue BlackRock and Vanguard, hugest controlling body in terms of corporations across the world. He was the guy who really brought the consciousness in 2020. Initially, again, 2020, a pivotal year. A lot of stuff was brought into the consciousness by certain players. So, and again, they have got so much power in terms of leading corporations and controlling them, being investment. We talked about they've got, something like 10, 11 trillion under management. So it's interesting that he's brought that into the awareness. And we've seen, obviously, in lockstep with what's happened with COVID, this really ramping up and, coming actually into effect in the EU, particularly officially, in January this year, Dan. So, again, the paperwork in 2004, and here we are again at this pivotal time. It's starting to be rolled out, and it's starting to be in the main consciousness, and I'm sure you'll get more into what we're seeing, sort of, with that.
Yeah, we'll go into how it's kind of manifesting and how it's playing out, but I think, the point around the EU, we'll come to that in a moment, because this is where things start to get really rocky, because when you take ideas and ideologies, having a report that an independent organization puts together that critically assesses a company is fine, because anyone is still left with a free choice whether to abide by that report or not, a series of checklists. But when those start to become law, when they start to become mandated, when they become strictly enforced, that's where things start to get really difficult. So since that originating report in 2004 by the UN, progressively over time, there has a lot of the things that were included in initial thinking around that are now becoming legislation.
Yeah.
So whether it's climate related or social justice related or politically related, brick by brick, the lobbying that comes with this is resulting in political change. Now, again, I'm politically homeless. I have been all my life. I don't have any allegiances, but there are some people that would support those ideals in legislation because of their own political values. But we have to realize that if we are to look at things holistically, that means we have to look at the two wings of the same bird and realize that to serve humanity, we don't just serve ourselves and our party. We have to serve all of humanity. And this very divisive tool, it's a very divide and conquer tool, is now through social engineering and through the political process is creeping into legislation. So I think it's a good time to introduce the way that ESG is it's kind of got two tranches. There's ESG investing, which it is all about bringing money into the equation.
Yeah.
So when you have to ask, if you really care about the environment, social causes, and governance, why has it become such a big investment decision? You're investing in the good causes. I understand the who cares wins, and we want to be shown to there's a virtue signaling component to that.
Totally.
But that's masked by the amount of money that is being plowed into and the investment mechanisms that's going into this. So the investment part is one issue, but in itself, it's the least dangerous part of it, because it's really, as I said, it's if people want to make choices on the types of things they want to invest in based upon their own personal values and preferences, that's slightly less harmful. The second component is where it gets more harmful, is the activism, the ESG activism, and the ESG corporate activism in particular, whereby this is where we're seeing a lot of the kind of more divisive policies. This is where we see the Budweiser and the Costa Coffee controversies, where they are being lobbied by organizations to undertake certain decisions as a company, which then has an impact on their ESG score. So what shocked me the most is, and for those of you who aren't aware, the way companies work, they have, certain voting shareholders and stakeholders who have certain voting rights every year. And more proposals are being levied at the table of the kind of stakeholder and shareholder voting process, with all of these proposals that meet these ESG criteria, but they are coming from activists. They're coming from activists with certain ideological narratives around the social justice space. And again, I know it's a very divisive subject, but here's what's happening: corporations are having their these proposals voted on and approved in increasingly large numbers. So it's no surprise why we see this sudden influx of kind of go woke, go broke ideology, this woke ideology that's coming with it, because it's going through the corporations through this activist process, which is where corporations become political without necessarily needing to connect with the political party process. Because when people think about politics, they're thinking about governments and party politics. Politics is far beyond that. Politics is becoming an ideal, a kind of weaponized ideal that is now being played out through companies through this activist process, where companies are now doing the bidding of activists through their activities. And this is where people are making political change by subverting the democratic political process. Because
100%, Dan, it's almost where the social engineers are, are using corporations to achieve through corporate actions. I've got one of the quotes here, that what they can't achieve through the traditional democratic political process.
Absolutely.
And we saw that during the COVID years, that actually, leaning on the business for them to be the enforcers, for them to set the stage, because that was multifaceted, because they couldn't, some of the things they were trying to enforce on people, they knew that wouldn't stand up if you enforced it directly from a governmental point of view on the people. But when you use the private entity, I always give the example, Dan, when the whole travel issue, it wasn't the border forces, it wasn't your government. If you come into UK and all that, nonsense of track and trace forms, it wasn't, all that stuff. And have you got the right paperwork? It was the airline that they got to enforce it and put the pressure on. when you went to the border control, they had no interest.
Mm.
And again, that's using these corporations and putting it on them and making them the vehicle. So again, that's the corporations really, they're being obviously having a big role in it, and also being played by the pressure put on them. So again, that's the modus operandi we're seeing again through ESG, as we did with COVID.
Yeah, so you're right. The term social engineering is the important piece for me here, because there's one thing, enforcing those types of policies under a certain set of circumstances which are unique to that period of time. But what we are now seeing is a gradual shift in our culture, driven by corporations, partly driven by corporations, because of course, the activism behind this isn't exclusively driven through corporations, but now it's almost like the political mechanism has failed. So certain organizations, think tanks, NGOs, activist groups, etc., have realized that there is great potential to make cultural and social change through corporations because of the influence that corporations have on our day-to-day lives. So this is the social engineering part, because when you start to bring in ideologies and you start to bring in narratives through corporations, of course, it's not just their products, it's their marketing, it's their social media presence. And that starts to have a ripple effect on society. And to the unquestioning mind, that people just see this as the way things are. And it's a natural evolutionary process. It's not a natural evolutionary process. It's a purposefully coordinated activity that has been driven through corporations, and now increasingly through centralized, global, unelected, unaccountable organizations who are in cahoots with these corporations. So it becomes it may have started. Where does it start? Where does it end? ESG began with the UN. Who planted that idea with the UN? Are they driving it? Is it being driven by the WEF? It's almost impossible. It's a murky mess of centralized organizations who operate in the same pond collaboratively in lockstep to drive these agendas. But they're utilizing corporations to drive these ideas forward. And, the public have no way other than voting with their wallet, which is what's happening. So this is where the kind of, go woke, go broke idea has come from, because, when Budweiser launched their beer with the LGBT kind of icon, I forget his name, or their name, I should say. It saw this huge backlash.
Dan, you've just had your ESG score go down by 1 point.
Did it go up or down? I'm not sure. I don't know. Like which one? Did it go up or down? It was like a stock. It went up and down in one breath.
Well, I just saw the alert come through on your screen there from from the WEF's metaverse calculator on live. AI has absolutely timed it, and you've got -1. So just be careful, Dan, because you're giving the sense that you don't care.
Right.
If you cared, you'd win. But you don't care, so you've just lost a point. Okay.
Oh dear me. Oh dear. Clown world. Well, so we'll come on to that points-based system in a minute, because that's an important point.
Yeah.
But we saw that obviously there's a backlash amongst the Budweiser consumers, and now I literally saw it popped up before this episode that Budweiser's profits have gone down 10.5%. No, their revenues have dropped 10.5% in the first quarter of 2023 since that campaign. So, it's had a real tangible impact. So their ESG score may have gone through the roof, but their bottom line, which ultimately still cash is king, cash flow is king. A company requires profitability in order to survive. So we saw that with Budweiser. We've seen it with Target. We've now seen it with Costa Coffee. And people are boycotting these companies now. But this is, again, where it becomes divide and rule, because this is where things become oversimplified and it becomes broken down to left versus right.
Yeah.
You're on team A over there supporting this. You're on team B going against this. And we lose that sense of humanity because of this. And that's a consequence of this particular type of activity, because whatever you think about the free market, I'm a free market advocate. Free market is apolitical. It doesn't discriminate. So if you want greater inclusivity, diversity, and equality, interestingly, the free market doesn't discriminate. Although you could argue, again, and this is where things get really interesting, you could argue that it does because of the ruling, elites that have greatest power in that marketplace, who tend to be of a certain trait. But because we've gone into identity politics as a way to try and tackle it, we're trying to tackle it via social issues. We've actually, bizarrely, in order to try and become more inclusive and diverse, we're actually majoring in the minor interest, which actually creates inequality for the major interests.
Yeah.
So it's shifted the balance the other way, whereas at least you had a mechanism before that was, it did not discriminate. But what it points to is it's actually the power structure that's the problem. And when we politicize it and put characteristics around it, whether it's gender or race, and make that the problem as opposed to the real root issue, it doesn't matter what clothes they're wearing at the time or what form they come in. It's the imbalance of power within society and the centralization of power in the current form that creates the issue, not what color their skin is or what race they are or whether they're deemed to be male or female or some abstract construct in the middle. It's about the power structure itself and the mechanisms that underpin that, in my view.
Totally, Dan. And what it comes to be, it's so usurped, any even remnants of a democratic process being involved in this.
Indeed.
The top-down nature. When you see they're talking about the major stakeholder in this whole agenda is nature. You could argue it's society, but they use the word nature. Well, my question is, who is speaking for nature then? It's the same centralized people creating the agenda. So that's the issue. It's not, if you're saying, well, everyone's a stakeholder, but you're not really listening to the stakeholders. We're not hearing, nature speak for itself, or not even the people speak for that. So exactly right, Dan, that polarization, which I'd argue that I'd say that the way the narratives control the internet, that it's almost made to look more polarized than it actually is on the ground.
Yes.
And so therefore these polarities get really pushed, and that leads to this feeling of polarity, but really, actually, it's a much smaller amount who are in that extreme camp of pushing it, and actually the majority of people, a large number aren't. So I think almost that polarity is accentuated on purpose, through the media. And I remember you talked about it when you talked about the comments you went about how they're literally looking to spike, and not have nuanced discussions and create those two camps. Because what it does then is that is, it makes people pro or against, rather than coming together to have a discussion of, well, what are the ramifications down the road? Where does this lead? Rather than what's the ideology today, even if it's based on good info, and it's not really based on good info often, it's based on obfuscation and headlines and emotion. But if you come together and said, okay, we think that, but let's all discuss, where does this lead? And that's why doing the research, taking the time, we see where this leads. And it goes far beyond, the ramifications are far further than what people just think of as short-term ideological. But that's where they've got people is, being too busy and being, on the hamster wheel and just getting sound bites and having a pro or against. And the reality, and that's where it's challenging. It takes more time. We have such long-form conversations, Dan, even on the podcast, but in the life we have them even longer, and I'm always having them. But often people say we want short soundbite, and I'm not against that. But it's almost like to get to get an understanding. How do we nurture longer conversations on a bigger level with people? Because you get trapped in these polarities.
Yes.
And no one wins, and that's the game. That's the point. No one wins apart from the people who are the puppets of those sides and who are spiking emotions. And meanwhile, the fundamentals results are actually not being looked at, and those are the results of these ideologies, the baseline.
I'm so pleased you said that, Sam. It's so important because it constantly separates and divides us, and we have to catch ourselves in that moment, because I know in this topic it's a heated. It could be perceived to be a heated conversation, but it doesn't need to be. It can be a rational conversation and an emotive conversation at the same time. And whether we admit it or not, we're all emotional creatures. We all respond emotionally, and then we later on rationalize logically, to different degrees. But the more divided we become divided on our emotionally ideological driven narratives, which means we're constantly separated from that more rational, logical conversation, which needs to happen in cahoots with the emotional reaction. And, the stakeholders, you're right. It's not like the planet is going, oh, I'm advocating for this. Like, actually, the planet has long survived human beings, and it will do. With or without us, the planet will continue. It's actually, nature itself, yes, it's being harmed by the hand of humans. But it's none of the conversation when we talk about climate. None of the conversation is actually about preservation of nature. None of it's actually about reducing pollution. It's a politicized conversation, which ultimately, when you look at this ESG through the investing arm, it's all about driving profit. Still, it's
Totally,
still
and the ramifications will not be harmful or problematic for the biggest corporations, who a lot of people would, even in the mainstream would argue, they are the biggest polluters and the problems to the environmental issues. They are not the ones who are going to be punished by ESG, because the ramifications of this agenda is always going to be more centralization and harder for smaller players, even with good intentions doing that. We talked about it, we talked about regulations in all sense of small business, how it stifles innovation and genuine ones, and it's going to lead to more centralization. So these huge corporations who are pushing this are probably the biggest, culprits of harming the environment. But this ESG isn't going to change them particularly, or threaten their existence, or mean that they're going to change massively, because they're already up that level. That people want to grow at small level, it's going to be another barrier to entry, a huge barrier to entry, and really favour again the bigger players and squeeze out the smaller people who can't comply. And again, you're complying with all coming from the top down, and again for the greater good. But who's deciding what the greater good is? And that use of the environment is such an emotive, clever one, and I see it down, in the younger generation, because that is being pushed so hard in the universities, and as part of the kind of cultural Marxism movement, which is massive within those a lot of those institutions. And of course, you're seeing to the level where people, almost bringing, climate guilt, that they're guilty about being alive. So again, this attack on people, which is you are the parasite. Now, that's where again the foundational bad science, or manipulated science, is supporting that, and that's the foundation. If you build on that, then that's where the ideology leads. But we always have to look at the foundation. That's what people who are skeptical, and in the communities, that's what we're always doing. We're questioning it. You don't have all the answers, but the problem is that they get people lost up in a debate up here without looking at the foundational. And if it's built on a foundational fallacy, something that's unproven, as we've seen with all these agendas, whether it's climate change or COVID, that becomes sacrosanct, gospel, and then we'll argue over how we deal with it. Well, hang on, if you get the underlying fraud often, then the rest is absolutely fraud built on top of it and is all irrelevant, whichever side you choose to be on. So again, that structure I'm seeing play out with ESG, and the concerns about where it leads to in terms of more centralization, and almost like you said, a social credit score on businesses. But at the end of the day, when you look at small businesses are people's livelihoods, and so it spreads out and it filters down to affect everybody, which is why we need to understand it and be pushing back.
Yeah, and I think the mechanisms are the important point to draw away in a way here, because you've got the corporations who are being lobbied through advocacy and activism to try and shift their policies. I mean, it's interesting because when the market responds in the way that it does, and that customers withdraw their purchase and start to boycott, you see that financial drop. So it's like they're being pushed from one side. There's like a push-pull. So they're being pushed from one side, and then there's a pull factor. So it's like they get their fingers burnt for actually doing what other people have asked them to do, and they're kind of caught in this quandary. But in a way, this is where it also gets dangerous, because it becomes like this Americanized idea of like the red state, the blue state, but at the corporation level. So it becomes even more fragmented. So it's like, if you're this type of person, you buy your beer from this company. If you're this type of person, you buy your beer from this company. And, that's the way that society is kind of heading.
Put you in a group, always put people in groups. And it's a very clever, because people think they're being empowered by being in a group, but actually it's an opposite effect of disempowering and labels and divide and conquer, rather than everybody being, sovereign individuals with different viewpoints and being on equal footing. It's social engineering. It's Tavistokian social engineering 101.
Well, it is, and that's the point where the behavioural science and the social engineering is overlaid across the ideology. So it's like the foundational points you talked about, and the kind of, the logical fallacies. Well, all of that is overridden, as we've seen, by the amount of social engineering and behavioural science that overlays over that. So it's people's minds can't compute on the logical fact when they're ideologically when they're kind of ideologically captured.
Totally. And it takes so much energy to look at those foundational lies, and they are so important. But if we don't do that, then exactly we're caught, and the powers that be are very happy if we'd be caught up in a debate that's kind of raging here, and it's a distraction from actually the foundational lie. And we clear out the financial fallacies and untruths at that level, then that changes the whole debate. And that's what's really problematic is if people won't look at the foundations. It's almost like I saw an advert locally down for a climate cafe, and it was all about, again, lots of well-intentioned people meeting up, but it said very clearly, I mean, it was quite stark. It said, very friendly, come to this climate cafe, discuss the environment, whatever. This is not a place to challenge any science.
Oh God!
I mean, and that's saying let's come together and chat as people, as citizens, but about these issues. But you're not allowed to come and challenge the science. So that's basically saying we're talking up here. You have to come with that is sacrosanct, that is set, and this is how this world works, Dan, isn't it? That's set, and then you can come and debate. You're free. It's a free world to come and debate on top of the foundational, lie. That's what we see so much. It's incredible.
Yeah, that's capture. It's like it's unconscious capture in some cases. It's deliberate capture in others. But and across all of this, then you've got the hypocrisy. The ones leveling these policies out are the ones flying around in private jets, polluting. The companies are polluting. They're profiting from the situation. Whilst the people, are the ones that suffer and become peasants in the pursuit of a net zero carbon society. Can't eat or heat. They can't eat or heat their homes because we've decided to swipe any source of energy that's currently viable. And by saying that, I'm not saying we shouldn't look at how we consume or produce energy. I'm just saying you just don't cut off the energy supply to people when they need to heat their homes to meet a deadline.
Exactly.
That's not people centric.
It's the rigged game, Dan, isn't it? Again, it's like if we look at financial crime. The big boys have the money to pay the fines. It's built into their accounting. I mean, they're literally built in their business plan. So they don't play by the rules because they can afford not to. If you're a small player and you're trying to do something genuine, you get absolutely hammered. So same with ESG. They're under no threat, and I think that's how they'll set it, that we're going to rein in these evil corporations, and that's not actually what's going to happen. We're actually going to control tightly, and be a barrier to innovation and change at a grassroots, people-centered, from that level down. That's not what's going to happen. We're imposing from above.
It's controlling the mindset, beliefs, attitudes, behaviours, actions, and consumption of the people. What that does mean then, it's that your social credit or your social credit or carbon credit score is up to you to manage. It doesn't matter about the corporations who are the one that creating the pollution in the first place. We're not going to do anything about that. Because they pay enough money to keep us quiet. But you, the citizen, will be controlled. You'll be tracked. You'll be traced. Meanwhile, the corporations get richer and richer. And that's the irony and hypocrisy around all of this is that the activists who are kind of channeling their energies through the corporations as part of this ESG activism are effectively upholding the corporatocracy, corporatism. So that's so far removed from the old. Yeah. If you were looking at the political divide, the kind of liberal left, and now essentially driving corporate culture.
I'm so glad you said that. It's such an important thing to notice. That is totally been turned on its head, and you're absolutely right. They become the kind of foot soldiers for what they've been railing against.
Yeah, but then it's like for the greater good again. It's like who cares wins? It doesn't matter. We'll compromise on our overall principles because it's for the greater good.
Yeah,
and therefore we're just left in this vicious cycle and a downward cycle. And then the big question is, well, does it even work? Like, does having this ESG score even work by means of? Is it improving the environment? Is it actually improving social standards? And is it improving governance? Well, let's look. So there's a Yale study that I've got the reference notes here saying that it does nothing for the environment. Basically, there's a big study done by Scientific Beta which says that the ESG ratings have little to no correlation to carbon intensity, even only when looking at the environmental pillar in isolation. There was a piece from the Harvard Business Review that said that unfortunately ESG funds don't seem to deliver better ESG performance, nor financial performance. So actually. The Journal of Finance paper also said that the same as ESG funds certainly perform poorly in financial terms. So they're not they're not actually delivering on their specified aims of making the environment better, supporting social change or governance. But you will find plenty of evidence to the contrary in very highly subjective terms to say that now that we're representing certain groups, whether it's the trans community or whatnot, and again, every group should be represented to some degree. But when we're trying to represent, that's part of the problem in itself. That representing then creates like this tit for tat situation where it's like, well, what about this group then? What about that group? And what about this group? Where's the advertising billboard for me? Where's my specific nuance where I'm half this or half that? And it's like, what? All right, like this thing. Yeah, I'm into Star Wars, but you don't care about Star Wars customers.
Yeah.
I'm not into Star Wars, but if I was,
you don't care about Star Wars, Dan.
Oh no, another point gone.
There you go.
Oh man,
you've got to care. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Being trapped in identities rather than if everybody's living, in tune with just natural law of do no harm and respecting others, then you don't need all this protection of identity. So again, it comes back to if humans were living in tune with just again common sense and organically living in natural law, then they don't need all that. And again, people think, oh, we've fallen on that, but actually, it's not happened organically. And I think
it's not happened organically. That's the point. It's being driven by big forces and big money now. And and the point is, the free market not perfect, absolutely, but it's apolitical, as we touched
on. What your point, Dan, about reading those reports that have clearly said that none of these measures have worked? What does that remind you of in the last 3 years? Some other measures that did nothing that they said they'd do, and obviously, like you said, all the kind of more intellectually based reports do exist, but they're not the reports, like you said, subjective reports that are on the front covers of newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to read, you're not going to have the Guardian or reading a long, giving 5 pages over to why nothing that you told need to be done and would save lives and help you has worked or has actually done the opposite and be very harmful. It does exist for somebody like you who's gone and researched it and found it, and we were there. But in terms of control the narrative, it's the same thing again, isn't it? Then all these measures absolutely need them. This is critical. Everyone, they've got the people behind that, same emotive for the greater good. But what's so is that short-term memory thing. They get people on the next agenda, and therefore people have forgotten enough. So the uproar doesn't come live while it's happening, and then they can move on. And it's interesting, Dan, because the ESG, there has been, thank God, there has been pushback. There are a lot of people seeing the ridiculousness of because it's like you said, it's gone far beyond the environment and being used almost for the agenda of the day. And from studying these kind of groups, how they push things is I've always seen they like to not put too many agendas together because they like to then move from one to the other and fill people's minds with them, which is why we read COVID curtain came down and the Ukraine curtain went up the next day, literally. I mean, if that wasn't a proof of how it's just right, we're fully with this and then we do that. I mean, just extraordinary, right? But the same thing here, we're seeing ESG agenda move there, and then we're seeing it push massively into the diversity in line with the LGBTQ stuff. That's where it's gone. But because there's been a pushback, and it's interesting. I think you found out, Dan, that Larry Fink has started to distance himself from it, from the term, because the term is now getting heat quite rightly, and people awareness and people talking about it. But what we often see is they'll shift the language. So he said, I'm distancing myself from that, from the very thing he brought into consciousness in 2020. But I know from doing my research, there are plenty of other monikers appearing that are the same thing, but dressed up differently. So there's one here, Dan, well, we're not talking about ESG anymore if it becomes too much of a hot potato and people are onto it. We'll talk about corporate sustainability reporting directives, which is the same thing. And it goes back to a lot of people were, starting to say, well, where's this global warming? Well, we'll change it to climate change, because then we're not caught in people questioning. Well, they're just going, well, and that's an easier one that no one can argue with. So we always see this rebranding, don't we, and it moving. So I'm really pleased to see a pushback, and I'm pleased to see that is happening. But it's always being on our guard that it will be dressed up in different clothing and different labeling, and and it all ties in with which is critical to understand. People want to research that is Agenda 2030. The UN sustainability goals, because it's really tied into that, isn't it? It's interweaved. It's really critical to understand that, because the ramifications of that are even further beyond just ESG.
It is, but again, everything we talked about so far around the idea of reasonable intent but questionable means. That a lot of the things within those, I don't know, my points are going to go up or down here, Sam, but if you actually just read the headline goals, that they're presented in a way that anyone can relate to and go, yeah, okay, well, of course we want clean water, of course we
Yes,
want access
exactly.
to
Yeah.
education, of course we want this. But it's how we get there. It's this
Yeah.
highly centralized, globalized, institutionalized command and control. And the control part is which is really important here, because within what you were just talking about, Sam, is the same with climate, COVID, etc. It's the human instinct to control.
Yeah.
It's because this is all an example of excess human interventionism. It's humans trying to intervene either often in nature with viruses and bacteria and climate issues. It's human interventionism. Now, okay, I get the counter argument that we are the ones that are building all these towers, putting all this stuff in the air. We are intervening
Yeah.
in everything we do. Everything is cause and effect if we break it down that simply. But it's the control element. It's the control element that's playing out here. And that's really key. But we've got to come back to our senses. We're talking about, does it work? Like, does it make sense to you that a tobacco company that, most of us will agree that the science show that, again, it could be shown differently over time. I'm not sacrosanct on this, but, most people understand that, smoking can contribute to certain illnesses that would result in death. They get a better score than a company that has an electric vehicle.
Yeah.
Like, what? Because Tesla has Elon Musk at the helm, which he doesn't fit the ESG mold. And again, I know Musk is a big conversation. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole today. But the point at simplicity is it's all fabricated around these ideologies and then centrally instituted. But where things now, I think, are heading on a dystopian path is with the building blocks that are coming through the legislation. So you touched on earlier on, Sam, how the EU now have passed this directive at the end of July this year, the ESG checklist, which is on the way to create strict enforcement in their own words. And I'll read it to you from the report. It says, passed by the European Parliament in late 2022, many companies based or operating in the EU are now bound to produce annual ESG reports backed by an increasing amount of data with other key reports such as financial information. And where this leads is that it will no longer be voluntary. It'll be mandatory reporting, but it says explicitly that this is about toughening standards and that standards will be strictly enforced. So this is going from a basic checklist. Again, if you want to invest in sustainable assets or environmentally friendly assets, that's fine. If if whether they work or not, well, that's down to you for your own discernment, quite frankly, but that's your personal choice. I'm all for choice, freedom, and making that discerned decision yourself. But when it comes down to taking these concepts, environmental social governance, and putting standards in place that are not democratically selected and then imposed upon not only companies but society as a whole in order to reach certain arbitrary targets, in this case, net zero by 2050, this is where things then start to get really dangerous, because we get highly centralized control mechanisms that are going beyond any individual ideal into a highly mechanized process that is centrally controlled and globally institutionalized. If it's EU-wise, that's a fair block of people. If this starts to go through the UN, and the UN are now, I don't know how the UN can get away with saying the world is now boiling. Okay, you might say it's a figure of speech. You could say it's a figure of speech as much as you like, but there are trading standards in most other areas where it would be described as misinformation. Anything else would lead to a fact checker saying, well, no, the world isn't boiling. But this is now being driven by the UN. It comes back full circle. The UN, the World Economic Forum, the big players, the Rockefellers, they're all intrinsically driving this, but now through not only lobbying corporations, but lobbying governments. And this is where it's not just national governments, it's international governments, EU, and the United Nations effectively operating as a global governance vehicle. So this is where we then become enslaved into this kind of dystopic global institutionalized framework that becomes increasingly strictly enforced. And that's when it's in the world of digital technology now. If this had happened 100 years ago, you would find it very hard to institutionalize. It would be manual work, manual ledgers, but now our behavior can be governed by the devices that we hold in our phone, because we saw it through COVID. Your QR code to get in and out of the building, your vaccine passports.
Yeah.
Now behavior, through ESG, social credit systems, behaviorally linked, and we're seeing it. Like, anyone who has their eyes closed may not be seeing this, but even now, like the story around the bank closures, you have to have certain right think or left think, you could call it, in certain ways to get a bank account. And again, banking, you never used to have to think about, what are my political views? What do I think about the environment? Can I get a bank account? You actually thought about, did I have my identity, to go and open an account? Not your social identity, your personal identity, your personal viewpoints, your personal ideologies. But now this is all coming through the corporations, and worse, through centralized organizations. And this is where we're on a really slippery slope. We've got to turn
Dan,
the corner.
I'm glad you brought up the issue with sort of the digitization, because again, I always talk about the technology being neutral. So digitization, when you talk about binary things, is fine, and again, not top down, just used, with good intent, but just for binary things, whether it's transacting or just doing that. But what we're going to see here, and what we're starting to see, is, binary data judging intention.
Yes.
And that's the real issue. So, using digital stuff for binary things like, just units and paying things, whatever, has no problem. But what we're seeing is it's going to take out human behavior and intention, and, into just, your company failed because of this metric. There's no one to answer to. It's like the YouTube algorithm, you've been pulled down. There's no one to have a discussion. We'll go, hang on, we'll look at this in context and see what the discussion was. It's irrelevant. You said this word, AI said that. Your company is, your new startup company has failed on some very complex binary target that, even with the best one in the world, you're struggling to find, trying to launch a business and meet all these requirements. That's just a straight line binary yes or no. And this is the danger. That's what I see. It's not that digital technology is a problem used in the right way and used used as a tool for us to efficiency, when we're controlling it, but when it's being imposed. And it's using binary judgments and getting rid of the human nuance and intention, Dan. So you could have a company with amazing intentions who want to do improve the environment, whatever, but they may not make it because they failed on some ESG score on day dot of their business, and they can't go through. But the big boys, I said, have always got the loopholes of finance. You see it in big food, Dan. They've got ways of getting an organic label if they're not. They've always got a way, so it's not a problem. It's actually a barrier to entry and a stifling of genuine innovation that's people-centered, based on real values and real tangible things in society. And that's what we've seen, Dan. You talked about it in small business, place you talked about, Bournemouth opening up, who couldn't meet requirements. They've got no problems. The society around them, they haven't got people right in the street going, this is a problem, but they can't meet some binary requirement that the council imposed because there are problems elsewhere in the world. And again, this is the centralization, like in the EU, judging everybody across the world with these metrics. And the world is different everywhere. There are different things going on. So that's the real danger. And seeing that when they bring this in and, or try to bring it in, we're seeing again this date of 2025 being key. And I've talked about 2025 a lot because that's when the COVID World Bank, loans get called in. I think it's a really critical one for the financial reset. I think a lot of things between now and then, if we are really going to ramp up, and 2025 is a kind of culmination for lots of different cycles. And it's interesting they're saying that that's when the actual mandatory reporting will come in. But it's about, imagine you've got a small company, your score is based not just on what you're doing, but all your consumers, all their scores affect your score, your suppliers. So this whole interlocking, again, what does that speak to me? Social credit score. Yes, it's not as scary to people. And again, I'd argue it's not scary to them as the personal one, but it's a roadmap towards it, isn't it? Because actually, if you're saying your consumers, well, your consumers are individuals. Well, we need to know what they're, you shouldn't be, and again, you shouldn't be dealing with them because of details about them that it's not your business. And it becomes this. I mean, it's nightmarish. Then it is, and that's why
it's totally nightmarish.
It's totally dystopian, nightmarish, and being aware of it and where it can go is really important. So we start to push back, and I always say I'm not. It's important to understand these agendas. Doesn't mean I feel defeated about any of it. Because I said the more the more dystopian it becomes, we talk about it in the nature of central bank digital currency, where they could go, the more you're going to get a reaction and pushing away. Now, they may have to sweep up the real hardcore people who not question anything, but you're going to create more people questioning, more of a pushback. So that dance is going to play out. How it plays out, no one knows. But bringing awareness to the topic and understanding that is really important for everybody. And so we can start reacting differently. And again, that's why knowing about these things, knowing about the roadmap, knowing that it's not an overnight thing and that it's actually been in progress for a long time, is your call to get decentralized as much as you can. Because if you're reliant, you talk about that, Dan, doesn't mean that maybe your company would fail, but maybe your funding gets cut off. That's the old classic way of controlling that in that world, especially with the financial reset, a lot of control is going to come with funding coming, bailouts and stuff to restart the economy and restart the new system. But it would be like, well, no, it's the old classic. You're free to trade whatever, but you don't qualify for this grant or that, that money that supports you. So only businesses that do. So again, that's not a level playing field.
Yeah.
So more and more, it's what everyone's doing, whether it's your finances, whether it's your food production, whether it's your commerce and services. The more you can decentralize, the more you stay out of that trap. They're building that, and you don't have to walk into it, but you need to have solutions and begin that road to look at those solutions now, because that will give you so many more benefits as these things ramp up.
Yeah, so I think that's so important, and at both ends of the scale of the conversation there, I think in one sense, we've pointed to the kind of dystopian reality that this could go to, but I see a lot of people living as though that is an inevitability, or communicating as though that's an inevitability. That leads to nihilism. That leads to complete withdrawal, shutdown, and the inability then to explore other solutions. I mean, we've seen it in the last few weeks when we're talking about, blockchain and central bank digital currencies versus Bitcoin. It's like, well, Bitcoin is an antidote to that, but the nihilism leads to, well, they're going to do this anyway. It's like, yeah, but they haven't done that yet.
Yeah.
So whilst I understand and agree that there's so much power in all of this, if that's the attitude that we have, we just withdraw, we do nothing.
Yeah, which is what they rely on. And
they rely on that.
And it's also, I say, how, they're building, almost like we talk about the financial reset, whatever, they've clearly said, we're coming for your assets. We want you to own nothing. How easy do you make it for them? And again, because I always give that example, Dan, it wasn't, often the illusion of power is so strong. It's small people and it's top down. It's not millions of people enforcing this on the street. They want you to walk into that world.
Yes.
Okay. Like people, walk to the, the jab centers, whatever. It wasn't coming. People went, but they were corralled and they were manipulated, and they were, that was using all the narratives and the emotion, whatever. And again, the same with this. They're corralling people, but you don't have to if you can take positive action. So I think that's absolutely, they are going to build systems and they will round up people who are going to walk into that system. You don't have to be one of them. But the way to not be one of them is to start building others. And I always say they haven't got, it's the illusion that they've got the power to enforce it across everybody. But if you have, locally a growing food, whatever, and doing that, they haven't got, it's not like somebody from the state or this corporate fashion is going to come around and do that. Yes, they'll try at certain levels, but generally, the more people doing that on a small level, in little groups, that is unpoliceable. Yes. That is real grassroots decentralization that, between yourselves and that isn't. And I don't think, the people who are pushing centers are fully aware of that. So what they want you to do is not to be doing that.
Yeah.
That's the biggest threat to, is you taking positive action. And like you said, Dan, not being caught in a future that hasn't happened yet and assume it has to happen. It's a hard job to get where they want to go. And if you just say it's definitely going to happen, then you're all giving energy to it, say it has.
Game over. Yep.
It's game over. And you're in action. So no one knows it will play out, but you're only improving your situation regardless of how successful or not they are. And that's where, again, you're becoming the driver of your own ship, aren't you? You're becoming the captain of your own ship, because rather than being totally beholden to their roadmap, well, yeah, they're on a roadmap. And they always say they're on a roadmap. They're moving forward with it. Are you on your roadmap moving forward with yours? And the more and more people are doing that, you're on that roadmap, then that gathers momentum, and that's a way to move forward.
Absolutely. And it comes up to everything we talk about: empowerment, personal responsibility. To me, it's really about becoming resilient and self-reliant, because we have to be resilient in the face of the propaganda and the machine that is driving all of this. But once our eyes are open, they don't close again. We are awake to these issues. Now, it's what we then do. It's from awakening to activation. That's the key. It's what actions will we take? And we do need our own roadmaps, absolutely. But we start with the simple steps. Any company that is politically divisive, let's break free from the divide and conquer. Anytime you catch yourself in the divide and conquer mentality, anytime you other people, bring yourself back to being pro-humanity, being someone who is for humankind, for human nature, and think about how would the highest version of you behave in the face of this divisive culture that is perpetuating what we're seeing here, because it is a tool of oppression. It's
You're right, Dan. The social engineers want you trapped in that. They want you trapped in that resistance to another group or whatever, rather than rising above it.
In groups and out groups.
Of course, it takes a lot of work and mindfulness and whatever, but it's going beyond that is where the progress is. The real progress, not the kind of progress that's being sold as an agenda.
Absolutely. So it comes back to what we can do as individuals, taking sovereignty of our own mind and being, standing guard at the door of our own minds, be discerning in terms of what we're consuming. But your point, Sam, to me, that if the heart of the problem is centralization, and the power that centralization wields, then the ultimate solution is decentralization, which comes back to making choices to support ideas, projects, companies, businesses that offer the possibility of decentralizing the power structure. That means shopping locally. It means, breaking free from the corporate structures. All of these things are within our realm, and they're actually simple steps that we can take.
Supporting each other is much more powerful than railing against what the state is doing. And again, also it doesn't mean I'm ever negating it or saying going to la 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 and ignoring it. You're vigilant, ready to react. But that's what a lot of us did into that code is what do? Supported each other. Rather than because that is where they want you is being dependent and in that kind of nanny state system and listening to what they're going to. Well, you're supporting each other in common sense and common values, and the more that happens, and that's why I say I think the division is really not, in reality, not as bad as it's being pushed across the algorithms on social media, and it's so easy for us. We all do it. I do it. You can start to look at a lot of stuff, and you still be very discerning, but you're getting a picture that isn't really in your street. And because probably, and understandably, you haven't spoken to everybody and had a nuanced on conversation. Some people you won't be able to, but probably if you could get or start to cut that more, you would find it's much grayer. It is a much grayer spectrum than the camps and the black and white, and for a lot of people, they're just in fear or their own stress. They're not really, pro this, pro that. I mean, there are people who've been activated or really caught up in it in a serious way, and who are viscerally, in those camps. But I don't think I really think it is less like that in reality than what is pushed down. I think that's pushed for a reason to spike that kind of.
But it also points to another part of the problem is the silent majority often stay on the sidelines.
Yes,
So that to me leads to another action. It's actually there's almost like a deafening silence in the space where we need to be having conversations. So the air is being sucked out. It's like a vacuum. It's a void. There's certain subjects that we can't talk about for fearing of being divisive. I think we have to be open-minded, open-hearted, and be willing to have the conversations that others aren't willing to have. That's an action that we have to take. But that, to me, that is about listening first. It's the old adage of Stephen Covey, seek first to understand before being understood, rather than imposing our will, our ideas, in which case we're just creating a counter-narrative, which, has a role. But it's actually seeking to understand. So if we're talking to someone who belongs to the silent majority, ask them what they think about the state of the world. Ask them what they think about the politicization of business. Ask, is it a good thing? And get their point of view first, and then offer the critical argument. Because that's how we start to build bridges, by listening first, acknowledging other people's points of view. And ultimately, a lot of the division in society is if you go on Twitter, no one is actually listening to each other. No one's actually playing an empathetic role and actually going, actually, I hear you, but this is there's a problem with what you're thinking there. So it comes back to that power within each of us to become empowered so that we can be role models for empathetic leadership, to actually listen, to hold the space, and then to to offer a counter perspective.
Which is why they push, during those lockdown times, very important to close social contact, for
Yes.
people to discuss what's going on and move people more into online space where it does become less nuanced and more spiky, And again, as I know, Dan, I've talked about it when I give talks, and I love giving in-person talks and long ones. It even with people with different views, it goes really well because because people. I'm trying to build a forum where we're open to. There's no right answer, and we're going to explore. And I've said to you, Dan, the only sort of issues I've had is people who don't come to a talk or just see a word on a poster and send an attack. So
Yes.
but and if they came because you understand what's going on, we're just having an open discussion. I've never had that in person, which shows that actually even people's viewpoints, they're not everyone sharing my viewpoint or we're all different viewpoints, but coming in person and creating that space, it's absolutely fine. But that's what there's lacking, and I'm so glad you mentioned that one of the biggest problems is the silent majority, and you can label it lots of ways. Some of it's apathy. A lot of it would be, to be kinder, is burnt out, traumatized.
Yes.
We talked about adrenal burnout last year, but last week. It seems like last year, Dan, because so much happened in a week.
Yeah.
But we talk about that because that's where people have gotten. So people are overwhelmed. So they're just on that survival, fight or flight moment. So, it's not that they're all pro these agendas and pushing that. A lot of good people with good, but they are exhausted, tired, and fighting for their own survival mentally and physically and practically and their families. And that's why any more debate, and you often see when you try and bring this, is almost like it's overload. And as we know, Dan, we've said often when you're bringing real critical thinking, you're bringing things that's quite scary to go through. So they feel like, even consciously or subconsciously, that you're just going to overload them, and it's too much. So a lot of it is a kind of no, but not a no because they are pro, the state's agendas. It's just like no, I can't.
I can't carry that baggage.
Yeah, I can't carry it. I can't carry it. So that is,
Yeah.
I think when we look at it, that's much more what's going on a mass level, and that's more realistic. So how do we garner more conversations and more people come together? But that does start with doing more community things, and being that example. If you start having good discussions with more people, then that resonates out. People know it's available, and that brings in. So, and I like what you said, Dan. Yeah, it's a roadmap. I always say people something, or some of you got some. I haven't. It's just the next step.
Yes.
It doesn't mean I've got to have some master plan. They've got their master plan. I've got to build my master plan this week and get it going. Your plan is that you're moving forward and you're starting to decentralize. And I always say I feel so much better when you're in motion and learning through that process and doing that. And that way you're helping not only yourself, but you're helping the others around you.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you said that. It feels like last week's episode was almost a year ago. Just a quick trailer for those of you who haven't seen last week's episode. We talked about the connection between health and wealth, and to me, this is an important part of our own resilience.
Yeah.
And as an update, in last week's episode, I said I was going to quit coffee. I was going to give up coffee. I'd become over dependent on the adrenal fatigue. We go into the whole thing in the last episode, but I will say the results have been profound. A week on since we recorded, it does feel like a week because I've had more energy, better sleep, clarity of thought, brighter mood, greater productivity. My productivity has been outstanding. It's needed to be. I'm 2 weeks away from, at the time, 2 weeks away from campout, now less than a week away. So I've had to have that increase in productivity. But my goodness, my clarity of thought, my ability to discern. So actually our ability to become resilient is, again, a personal journey. So if you haven't seen last week's episode, go and check it out. If this is your first viewing, it's our 20th episode now, go and check out our last episode where we talk about health and wealth. It's a great way to build physical resilience. Now, this episode is being published on Tuesday, the 8th of August, which means coming up this weekend, we have the Campout Gathering, where our dear man, Sam, is going to be giving a session. Sam, I'd love you to give a quick plug for what you're going to be talking about at this year's Campout.
Yeah, well, it's a nice time to segue into it because it's exactly what we just finished talking about. Organic there was garnering bigger conversations, for not looking for having to have all agreement, but coming together and sharing and listening to each other. And that's why I'm really excited, Dan. I know you had such an amazing experience there last year, and that's why I feel really excited to be invited to speak there. And obviously people know my sort of topic that I really dig into is a financial reset and crypto and understand that. And what I bring to that is a holistic, big view and person centered. So let's come together. So although I'm going to be presenting a crypto cafe morning on the Saturday in the hub, is it called the hub? Dan,
Yes,
one
the
of the
main hub.
stages there
Yep,
in the
yep,
hub.
yep.
We're going to have a long format, and what's great also, like myself, a lot of speakers, we're all going to be around for the weekend sharing. So it's not just, again, we talk about consume for an hour and a half, get all this and then go. It's about long form and thinking and coming back. So I always say that when I love doing the longer events and any thing weekend, because it's almost like always around a talk saying, I'm going to be around, come and chew the cud. I want to hear perspectives and share and have time, and I might even have a coffee, Dan. Maybe I might even have one really nice coffee.
Yes,
I've seen you've got
coffee,
I've seen you've got a really
really
good
nice coffee. Yeah, we
coffee
have.
juice there, but really enjoy it intentional. But yeah, I think look at it holistically. Put a lot more meat on the bones for people about the good, bad, and ugly sides of this digital shift that's happening. Why that's happening. I always say separating out, because that's what's important, and it goes in tune with what we talked about today. That it will absolutely shine a light on what the top players, what their plan is, what their roadmap is with this new technological shift that's happening, but also where you can go with it and the options. And I think that's what people don't realize, that they can be overly obsessed with they've got a roadmap, but as I always say, Dan, they don't control the cycles or all the shifts or what's burgeoning. It's just they want to harness it and go in a certain direction with it. If we can understand that actually we've got the power and choice to go different ways, harness it in a different way, and we and get in tune that we're in a changing time and this is really creative, and get that energy moving. So yeah, what's great is I'll be doing a kind of intro to financial reset and obviously crypto, but also be there for lots of Q&A, chatting, and hopefully I'll get to have lots of interesting discussions over the weekend. I think we're going to try and record an episode there, Dan, have a chat, and that's what's really about, coming together, all your perspectives, and having that dialogue, nuanced dialogue, and improving each other's awareness of different topics, learning from each other, and seeing how we can all, add value to each other's lives. And I mean, yeah, I'm excited for it now. I'm excited, and the weather looks good.
Oh yeah, I'm just looking at it now. Yeah, 26, 26, 23, sun shining. Oh, happy days.
Because despite this global warming, this is this July in the UK has been absolutely a challenge for me, who's spent a lot more time in warmer climates and loves that. So really great, because that also harnesses outside conversations and again, like you said, there's a people from wide range of I don't want to call it political spectrums, but just wide range of spectrums and experiences,
indeed,
life experiences from different parts of the world. So I'm really excited. It's going to be it's going to be a great event. I'm sure of it. And I know how hard, from seeing how tired you are, how hard you're working on it with your team, Dan, and take my hat off to you, because it's it's a big thing to bring together, but this is great work to be doing to harness those conversations. So it's perfect with what we've talked about today and the roadmap forward.
Absolutely, and over the course of the event, we'll have the opportunity to have those nuanced discussions around a range of topics, including health. What we talked about today, self-sovereignty and self-reliance. It is a place that merges the kind of personal awakening with the system's change. That's what I'm excited about. Yeah, so
because you can't separate them, Dan. That's the people always go, well, that, but actually, it all interlocks. Everything, I go, if you're looking at your business, well, your business goes better when you're going better. And then again, come back to stuff. Everything goes better when you're going better. You're able to communicate more. You're able to take more of you. You're more. I mean, I know, Dan. There was an amazing colonic therapist who I used to watch, because he gave amazing cleansing videos, and he said he'd have people come in for a session, who were not nice when they came in, and when they left, just because they cleansed out, some of the gunk that was in their system. Also, they were lovely, empathetic people. and so again, and that's a reflection, which I said last week, that the food and choice, whatever, is one of the biggest control structures, because a lot of people are stressed out, angry, overstimulated, pulsating, whatever, and therefore that reflects society, and then that escalates. We're all like that with each other. So it does start, it, because we all know it. When you're around somebody really calm, that calms you. If you're around somebody who's really het up, that hets you up. So again, this is why profound change does start that way, longer term, doesn't it? I mean, that's why it's important to look at that and not get too attached just in separating out the different issues. They are all holistic and interwoven. So we have to look at it in that state, and looking at things in that state takes longer conversations and more thought.
Indeed.
So it's not going to get that in a soundbite.
Absolutely. So if you're watching this on the day of release, you're releasing this on Tuesday, the 8th of August. The event is the 10th. It's this week. It's the 10th. to the 13th of August at Braziers Park in Oxfordshire. Go to campout.live to get your tickets. Come and join us. Come and meet Sam. Come and take part in the 4-day event. It's going to be talks, workshops, wellbeing activities, music, celebration, great food, great coffee if you want to drink coffee as well. I might break my, I'll see on the day, but yeah, we have got a really great supply. And just like-minded people who are concerned about the state of the world and exploring this journey of how we can make ourselves and the world a better place. So go to campout.live to get your tickets. And as a special incentive, I'm delighted to say if you use the discount code RESET, you'll get 10% off your tickets. So that's RESET, and you get 10% off your tickets. We'd love to see you this weekend. Now, hopefully you found value in today's conversation, and you also connect with the idea that actually if we can have grounded, calm conversations about these things, we can really make an impact. But I do want to ramp up a little bit of our urgency as we close out, because these issues are happening and they're happening fast, and we do need to be able to have these conversations more widely. So I encourage you to hit that share button, help people to get informed about these issues, because we can blink and before we know it, we'll be in that social credit system we've talked about if we don't choose a different path. So there is an urgency to this, and we must respect that. And as a result, I ask you, please comment, let me know your thoughts, engage with this episode, and hit the share button, because where else is this conversation happening? So take responsibility today, help spread the word. Let's expand the conversation, hit that share button, and hopefully we'll see you around the campfire at Campout 2023. Thanks for watching today's episode of the Uncharted Territory podcast with myself and my wonderful co-host, Sam X.